Sometimes the setting of a story, it's almost too on the nose. Like it was written up in Hollywood to make everything more dramatic. And Gary, Indiana, it's one of those places. Ellie's family had already moved around quite a bit by the time they landed in Gary. And her new hometown kind of gave her the creeps. Its thriving industrial days are long gone, and now the skyline is littered with skeletal factories, all broken windows and rusting frames. It's an eerily quiet place, and the remnants of its bygone glory days have faded into haunting, crumbling relics. It's like something out of a Stephen King novel, the kind of ghost town where the people who still remain seem lulled into a sort of melancholy and vaguely threatening stupor. I don't mean to be harsh or overly dramatic. Like any city that has fallen on hard times, Gary has its locals who are proud of its history and are actively working to revitalize their community. But if you have ever been there, or even just driven through Gary, I think you might know what I'm talking about. This was a boom town before it was a ghost town, but when it fell hard. The industrial collapse of the Rust Belt was at its most devastating in Gary. And by the early 90s, it had even been labeled the murder capital of America. My own experience with Gary is the same as many others who grew up around the Midwest. It was a place to drive through on the way to Chicago. Maybe you'd catch a whiff of smoke or the acrid tang of something rusty or burning. Or maybe you'd think, so this is where Michael Jackson came from. But mostly, you'd just see all the empty streets and abandoned neighborhoods. And you'd lock your car door and be glad to keep moving. But as a teenager, Ellie didn't have that luxury. For better or worse, mostly worse, Gary, Indiana was her new home. And when the time came for her to start therapy, it turned out that Gary was the perfect setting for the man she would end up working with. The dingy, haunting city was matched only by his dingy, haunting office. And the eerie sense of foreboding that Ellie felt in Gary, the sense that something ominous was always waiting around the next corner, it was never more accurate than when she was in that office. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. My guest today is Ellie, who started therapy when she was just 17 to help her cope with a difficult childhood.
So I am the oldest of 5 children. My parents are just fundamentalists in general, but they would lean more towards Southern Baptist. But it was just a lot of lack of structure. We would constantly be moving and changing churches, changing places that we belong, especially during my high school years. Probably about 6 or 7 times in 5 years, and then many houses in between and many churches in between. I was homeschooled, which made it a little bit easier with all the moving and traveling and meeting new people, but it just never felt like I had roots in a certain place. It just didn't feel very stable. We were provided for food, clothing, and material items, but I just don't feel like they were very much there for us emotionally, mentally. We were just kind of extensions of themselves as their children. I do feel like a lot of the pressure was put on me as the oldest as well, not just to set a good example, as they would say, but also to do a lot of the raising. A lot of it was my responsibility to raise my siblings, care for my siblings, physical needs, schooling needs even. I was just kind of designated extra mom. And I felt like that I was also very parentified by my parents as well, because of being the oldest, they would oftentimes talk to me like I was already an adult, where I didn't really get to experience my childhood. I just kind of had to be an adult as soon as my siblings were born. It was just a lot of pressure.
Ellie's parents were very strict and kept an extremely tight rein on the family. They didn't want their kids exposed to any outside worldviews through things like traditional schooling. They also fought a lot. Looking back, Ellie says their home was a very unstable environment. She thinks her parents probably had their own mental health issues going on, and they had a very hard time maintaining friendships and social connections. But instead of turning to therapy or other forms of help, they hyperfixated on their faith, and they tried praying their problems away. Like a lot of firstborn kids, Ellie was forced out of childhood way too early. The family started to depend on her to fill in the gaps left by her parents, meaning her own needs ended up more or less ignored. In that kind of environment, when teenagers' needs aren't being met, and when home isn't a safe place to express big emotions, an incredibly common reaction, you could even call it a coping mechanism, is self-harm.
The self-harm or cutting, they're superficial, but they started about, I'd say like 14 or 15, so my teenage years. At the time, I didn't really know why I was doing it. It just felt like some sort of a release that I could not express outwardly in my house. Not a safe place exactly to express strong emotions or emotional needs, really. So it felt like this release that I was able to have just between myself that kind of got me through tough times that I felt like I didn't have control over. And it wasn't until I actually cut myself pretty good and my boyfriend at the time called the hospital, and that's when they forced me to go get mandated in therapy. When I was admitted to the hospital for cutting, the assigned counselor that came to my bedside talked to me and my mom about possible solutions to this problem that could involve outpatient therapy before inputting me into an overnight place. She suggested that I get a certified counselor, not someone just from the church who was a teacher, someone qualified. So my parents kind of set out that day to find someone that they approved of, that they thought was qualified, but that also maybe would have some Christian personal background. And that's exactly what they did. But it wasn't until actually that I got my therapist that I was able to really understand why I did it. At the time, he described it as a need for control and that it was kind of matching on the outside how I felt on the inside.
Studies have shown that as many as 1 in 5 teenagers has experienced moments of self-harm. When so much about adolescence feels tumultuous and out of control, repetitive self-harm can feel precise and contained, almost ritualistic. Adults might scoff it off as teenage histrionics or a need for attention, but it's really no laughing matter. When young people turn to harming their own bodies, it means something is very wrong, and they don't know where to go for help. It's not always about suicidal ideation, or even a desire to cause themselves pain. Just as often, it's about a need to be able to control something when so much else feels uncontrollable. And it's about the rush of endorphins that can flood in after the moment of harm, the alarming feeling that, against all logic, this pain can actually be making them feel better, at least for a few minutes. Ellie's parents did notice a couple times that she had been cutting, but they brushed it off as not a big deal. But after her hospitalization, they agreed to her starting therapy, as long as it was on their terms, meaning as long as it was with a Christian counselor. This is when her family was living in the ever-eerie Gary, Indiana, which again is a fitting place for the therapist Ellie ended up meeting.
The vibes are off already. I go in and the place is really small, kind of dingy, kind of dark. It feels very black market. It just feels really uncomfortable. But to me, it seemed like just an old place rented out. He comes out, he's an older man, probably in his 60s, introduces himself. He seems very confident, very sure of himself. He was older. He kind of an average build. I'm not going to lie, he's kind of forgettable looking. Right off the bat, he kind of gives some compliments oh, you're doing great for your age, which I just chalked up to just meeting each other, being nice. So yeah, nothing stuck out to me when I met him other than just the office was kind of scary. We just kind of introduced ourselves. We went over the reasons, obviously, why I needed therapy, which was for self-harm. He kind of briefed me on his note keeping, which looking back now is a huge red flag. But at the time, he said, I don't keep notes for my patients at all. And he kind of sold it in a way that for teenage me, it's, oh, this is an adult on my side. He said it like, I won't share anything that happens in our sessions with another soul. It's just between you and me. I don't keep notes. And if something were to happen, let's say with your parents, where they take me to court and want to know what's happened in the sessions, I'll just say I forgot to keep notes and that I don't recall, which looking back now is a huge red flag. But at the time, I was like, oh, wow, this is somebody who gets it. I have strict parents. He knows what I'm going through. He's on my side. So it was just definitely a false sense of camaraderie. He's on my team.
This kind of thing is surprisingly common with unethical therapists. They might present their lack of note-taking as a good thing, a sign of loyalty and camaraderie. But in practice, it often just means they're doing their best to avoid any form of oversight and accountability. Ellie says her therapist, who she calls Robbie, presented in a very practiced, matter-of-fact way, like it was just another part of his intake routine. Don't worry. Nobody else needs to know what happens in this room. For the first month or so, Ellie met with Robbie twice a week. And for a little bit at least, it seemed like therapy might actually prove to be helpful.
At first, I really do feel this bond and feel this trust with him. I feel like he's the one adult on my side because of the situation with my parents. I feel very isolated and alone out in Indiana. I've only lived there a few months. I want to go back to Washington, which is where my boyfriend at the time lives and most of my friends. So I'm already just in an unfamiliar, vulnerable state. And I felt like he was really on my side. I felt like he really understood. He would give me coping mechanisms for self-harm. He would explain to me why I was self-harming in the first place. He put it in a way that I could really understand and that was actually really helpful at the time. Gave me some alternatives to self-harm. For example, he would tell me to write down how I'm feeling and then destroy the paper or go for a walk. I will say he did help me get through my self-harming tendencies, and I did stop completely at the time. Did show some improvement with my parents. I had a job at the time as a cashier. I showed a little improvement with talking to people and just kind of getting out of my shell. So at first, it did improve my confidence. I felt special. He would say, I'm very strong, I'm very smart. Just kind of give me special treatment with each meeting. And at first, it definitely did make me feel confident and made me feel special.
Special treatment can often occur in overt and dramatic ways. A therapist going out of their way to treat certain clients differently than others. But sometimes it's less obvious. Sometimes it's more about the feelings being evoked. For a parentified teenager who's in a lot of pain and whose needs aren't being met at home, the attention and affirmation of a therapist, it can be intoxicating. And in the case of a harmful therapist, that's exactly the point.
He would always start his sessions with a compliment like, oh, you look beautiful today, or oh, I love your outfit. And then it would slowly progress to a more and more inappropriate territory. Oh, I love the way your body fills out that outfit, or your boyfriend must be so lucky to be with you. Things that are obviously very inappropriate to say to a client. But to me, since it was such a slow fade and he kind of always started out really complimenty and I guess flirtatious, I didn't see how inappropriate it was at the time. I started getting really uncomfortable. And this is where the dynamic really shifted from, oh, you're so cute and smart and I love having you as a client and I'm always here for you, to, oh, you're kind of being difficult in being uncomfortable with me. Controlling the way that I feel about his actions towards me. It's not enough that I'm uncomfortable. I have to hide that from him as well. He would get upset if I didn't accept a compliment or ignored it, or he would get upset if I said, I don't really want to talk about that. If he would start asking about me and my boyfriend, how often we sext each other, how often we talk. He would start asking really personal, intimate questions that didn't have to do with self-harm. And whenever I would express my discomfort or like, oh, I don't really want to talk about that this session, he would remind me that he's helping me out at a discounted rate, that he's helping my parents out. He would remind me, I'm on your side. You need to be grateful. And basically just invalidate any uncomfortable feelings that I had. He would not allow them. They were not allowed. I was being ridiculous. He's helping. I need to be grateful.
You need to be grateful. This is part of what can be so confusing and disorienting about therapy harm. Therapy with Robbie had helped Ellie in some ways. She had more of an understanding of why she turned to self-harm, and she was learning to develop healthier coping mechanisms. When you're making real progress towards your goals, it can be even more difficult to recognize when therapeutic dynamics start turning toxic. Harmful therapists are well aware of this. They see clients' progress as a testament to their expertise and professionalism, and as a reason for their clients to remain loyal, grateful, and dependent on them, no matter what. And it can be crazy-making.
It was very much a mental tug of war where I would feel so uncomfortable and so icked out by some of the things that he would ask and say, but he would just gaslight and invalidate it and make me feel bad for even mentioning it, make me feel disgusting for even saying that it was crossing boundaries or too far. So then it just felt like guilt. But he would use God as his excuse always. If I were doing something that I shouldn't be doing, like having sex with my boyfriend, he would want to know the details. And when I would say I'm uncomfortable sharing those details, he would be like, well, this is a sin and you need to be open with what your sins are if you want to be a good Christian. I remember one particular session. It was probably the time he pushed the boundary the furthest. I was sitting across from him. He had this smug look on his face. And he was, so I want to know, as your counselor, when was the first time that you ever watched porn? I just felt so uncomfortable sharing that because one, it had happened when I was even younger, at a younger age, obviously exploring myself. And two, it had nothing to do with what we had been talking about in the session leading up to this question. It had nothing to do with why I had gone to therapy in the first place. But he was adamant on knowing not just when and how it happened or where. He wanted to know every detail about it. He would even ask me to retell stories sometimes that he had already heard. He would try and spin it as a lesson. See, you're able to talk about it with more ease this time. You've shown improvement. And when I said that makes me really uncomfortable, I don't want to share that information, he turned it on me and said, this is you sinning against God, though. You need to be open about you messing up. You need to be able to share your sins. And he pretty much just doubled down. And eventually I just gave in. I just told him exactly what I had watched, how I'd watched it. And I felt so disgusting as I did and just so ashamed because at the time I still did consider myself a Christian. So I did, of course, have feelings of shame and guilt, like I had sinned against God as well. And that I was just this unforgivable sinner. And I remember telling him the story and just kind of seeing his face across from me in the room as I was so uncomfortable recounting my story. I just saw this smug look in his eyes like, I gotcha, I win after this argument. It was just the most disgusting, dehumanizing moments in my life because I just felt I was giving everything to him, all of my emotional baggage, all of my shame. I was laying it out for him and he was just laughing at me, smirking at me in his chair.
None of this sounds like even remotely sound therapeutic methodology. Maybe it was more informed by the purity culture that often exists in fundamentalist circles, which sometimes seems to accomplish nothing more than fostering a hyperfixation on sex. And when questions of spiritual authority compound the already tricky power dynamics in therapy, the therapist might just decide it's their job to play God. When Ellie describes Robbie's smug little smirk and his need for all the lurid details, it frankly starts to sound almost masturbatory, like he was getting off on her experiences of teenage sexuality. But he could mask it in the cloak of religion. So if Ellie didn't completely bare herself and tell him everything he wanted to know, then she wasn't just a bad client. She was an outright sinner. Ellie was already used to feeling shame and guilt at home and at church. Now she was getting it from the man who was supposed to be helping her heal. And worse, he seemed to be enjoying it. As weeks wore on, Ellie started dreading each session. She would go in and dissociate, essentially freezing up and just watching the clock, doing the bare minimum to get through the hour.
I did, in passing, mention to my parents that I'd prefer not to see him. Maybe I should see a female provider. I tried to sell it to my parents like, oh, I just feel a little uncomfortable because he's a man and I'm a girl. Maybe I should get a woman therapist. But I was so close to turning 18 within a few months that my parents were like, deal with it. As a mom, too, I can't even imagine. But I got my parents to kind of slow it down also under the excuse of money as well, because we still were paying him. I was no longer self-harming. I was in a better headspace, so I was able to bring it down to a little bit less, about once a week towards the last couple months. With each session, I felt less and less engaged and just more and more withdrawn into myself. I felt very just ashamed. I felt like it was my fault that I had these sinful sexual problems as a teenager. I was the one ruining our professional relationship because I had these issues that I had to talk about. I felt like it was all my fault and just very ashamed. Towards the end, it was very much almost a mutual agreement that my time is almost up, but that he's still going to continue asking gross and inappropriate questions because he can get away with it, because I'm almost 18 and it'll no longer be his problem. So I remember the last session just feeling kind of bad that it had gone this way, that I had felt so weird about it and so uncomfortable. I remember just kind of saying, thank you for helping. Thank you for the coping mechanisms you've given me, and kind of just, we'll keep in touch. And I never did, never reached back out. He never reached back out. So it kind of almost felt like this mutual understanding that the clock was running out. And once it was gone, it was gone.
Ellie was so glad to be done with him. But her relationship with him, it proved to have profound effects on her life. She even felt guilty about how things had ended. Like she was too closed off. She wasn't really ready to do the hard work of healing. Because remember, Robbie had been helpful early on. And if their work together fizzled out, then it must have been her fault, right? Robbie's intense shaming of her, it had other far-reaching impacts too.
In the fundamental church, if you're struggling with sexual sins, sexual urges, the main encouragement is for you to get married to your partner as soon as possible. And since I was 17, almost turning 18, it was his Christian advice that I get married as soon as possible, which is the day I turned 18. So the day I turned 18, I got married to my boyfriend because I struggled with sexual urges and problems, apparently. If I would have had my own autonomy and choice at the time, I don't think I would have married him as soon. I may not have married him at all. So I definitely felt very pressured into following the Christian lifestyle as well. It may sound dramatic, but I feel that it really did change the trajectory of my life. I feel that I would have made different decisions if it wouldn't have been for his influence, specifically in marrying at 18 to escape sexual sin, but that I chose just out of shame and out of guilt from our sessions.
Ellie's first husband turned out to be abusive, and he figured out how to use her experiences with Robbie against her. In her shame, she felt like she wasn't good enough or capable enough to stand on her own. And she couldn't look for professional help because Robbie had left her with a profound distrust of therapists. He also left her with deep self-esteem issues and an ongoing struggle to grow a healthy sense of herself in relationships and sexuality. She and her husband would end up divorcing a few years after they got married. But first they had a son together. And it was that experience, becoming a new mom at 20, that prompted Ellie to return to therapy.
It wasn't until I experienced postpartum depression that I was referred to a provider from my OB, and they were able to show me and model what real ethical therapy was, because until then I hadn't really experienced it. I had only experienced him and maybe a pastor. It really was a breath of fresh air to know and to just validate that after all that time, I wasn't crazy, that those things were inappropriate to talk about during that session. That's not what the focus of our therapy was about. And it definitely was not appropriate at my age. They were able to finally give me that validation that I had needed that I wouldn't have even gotten from my husband at the time. I don't want to say I'm not religious, but it was a godsend. It really was. Within working in my childhood wounds, I found that this was a huge factor in my young adult life. So it's been a long road dealing with it. I still don't feel like I'm 100% healed, or maybe never will be. Being able to talk about it, especially with this podcast, has been great. Just knowing that I'm not alone, that there's others out there who also have seen and recognized the patterns of therapy abuse as well. It's not just an isolated incident. It does happen.
An experience with an ethical therapist, plus the insights of people in her community, really helped Ellie believe that she wasn't just crazy. Something had been deeply wrong with how Robbie had treated her. And it was absolutely not her fault. There's even a sense of relief that she was able to get out when she did, before things might have gotten worse. Maybe you had the same thought while listening to her story. If you've been abused yourself, or you're aware of the dynamics of abuse, maybe you had those same alarm bells going off in your head. There were red flags all over the place. A million different ways this story could have turned so much darker. I had those same alarm bells going off too. And not just on Ellie's behalf, because nothing about Robbie's behavior suggests that this was his first time being a creep. I keep wondering, though, who else might he have hurt? And how much further was he willing to go? When I first spoke to Ellie, she hadn't been able to file a report on Robbie yet, or really dig into his background. And I get it, it can be a daunting process, but she didn't even know what she would put in the report. She was sure that she had been harmed, but was he really being a full-on perv? Or were his religious motives more sincere than that? The doubts and second guessing that often follow an experience like this, it can be really disorienting. But when I offered to look into his record for her, she was more than on board. And here's what I found. His mental health counseling license has been officially suspended by the state for having, quote unquote, sexual contact with a client. But get this, his profile on Psychology Today is still active. His website is rebranded with language of coaching, and it refers vaguely to counseling without using the official term of licensed mental health counselor. This is a good time to mention that certain terms are protected by licensing standards, while others are not. Standards can vary wildly from state to state, but in general, the language is mostly the same. Terms like psychologist, licensed professional counselor or social worker, marriage and family therapist, and psychiatrist. These are officially protected terms, meaning practitioners must meet at least minimum standards of education, training, and state licensure. But other words, like coach, counselor, spiritual director, and in some states even therapist, are not officially protected. Practitioners might train with some network or another for the sake of credibility, but their credentials are not governed by any formal state standards. That means people can practice under those words with little to no qualifications or oversight. All this to say, if you're considering therapy, it's a good idea to look up what terms are protected in your state and what the requirements are to practice under those terms. And pay very close attention to the language any potential therapist uses to describe themselves. It is alarming, to say the least, that a therapist can have their state license suspended and then just rebrand under different terminology, with future clients none the wiser. So I decided to reach out to Robbie via Psychology Today and see if he's accepting new therapy clients. He got right back to me and asked we move our communication to texting. He told me that he'd be happy to work with me and that he charged clients on a sliding scale because he treats his practice less like a business and more like, a ministry. And no, you're not alone. This gives me all the icks as well. When I called Ellie to tell her what I had learned, she was devastated to hear that someone else had been victimized. But it also really helped validate her own experience. she wasn't just crazy or making something out of nothing.
It was blaringly obvious that it wasn't just all in my head. It was very sad and heartbreaking to see that he had also victimized someone else. At the same time, weirdly validating that it wasn't all in my head. You know how you can victim blame yourself and just say, oh, maybe I was overthinking it. It really put it on paper. Apparently, he slept with another client shortly after I had been in his care as well. So it was, I think, within a year, he had done this to another client who was also in a vulnerable situation. It said he was her church leader. He went to her church. So there was definitely a power imbalance there. I know it sounds silly, but what really stuck out to me in the report and just made my hair stand on end, just gave me goosebumps, was the fact that he said that there's no windows in this office. That was a direct quote that he gave the client that he ended up sleeping with. That was one of the first things that I noticed when I went into his office, just how dingy and dark and creepy it felt being in there because there was just no windows. And I feel like that was almost a strategy he used. No accountability, no windows. So yeah, it just really stuck out to me that he so brazenly said that this was something he brought up their first session. Nobody's watching.
Seeing the evidence of somebody else's story was the boost Ellie needed to start the process of filing her own complaint.
So after I filed my complaint, I got a call from the department with the Attorney General where they handle complaints like this, probably within a couple weeks. So I'd say within 2 weeks, they called me. It was a lady, and she basically just called saying, hey, we want to ask some more follow-up questions about your consumer complaint. And I sat on it for quite a while, just kind of going back and forth. Should I talk to them? I don't want to say I was disappointed that they called, but I was almost a little disappointed that they asked for more information because I felt like we did our very best to give them everything that I had. When I called back, it really, really rubbed me the wrong way because of just the way she answered the phone. She was just very much, oh, hey, you're calling back. She was just, yeah, let's get you scheduled. Is this a good number? She would cut me off as I'm talking. Yeah, this is a good number. Then she would be like, we need to get you scheduled, but I'm busy this, and this day. And it was just very impersonal the way she was saying it. And she seemed like she was disappointed that I was inconveniencing her. It kind of hurt to be dismissed like that, even if it's just in her tone. Again, I could be reading into it too much. Yeah, so I get the phone call scheduled, and immediately as I answer the phone, both of them introduce themselves on the call. They both had that same attitude as the first time when I scheduled with her, just that this was a big inconvenience and they just need to set the record straight, just need to do their jobs, and that I should just comply and shut up, not be emotional. To me, I was getting very emotional thinking about how bad the call, I guess, could go. I didn't want to be dismissed any more than I was in the beginning, so I decided to just hang up.
Pursuing any form of accountability for therapy harm is far from an easy task. The complaint process can be cold, bureaucratic, and for many people, re-traumatizing. Ellie didn't like feeling like she was the one being put on trial, or like her case was just another box to check off. It was encouraging that the state agency was being active and seemed to be taking her story seriously. But if you're not ready for that process, it can feel like getting caught up in a very big and very scary machine.
I'm thinking I might also send an email and just say, hey, maybe I'm just not ready to have a phone call about this. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. So then it takes a lot of the pressure off of in the moment. It's so emotional, and just kind of be honest and say, I don't really like how the phone call went. It just seemed a little impersonal for something so personal to me.
Ellie did reach back out to investigators through email. She told them how the thought of rehashing all of the details through a phone call was too daunting. They agreed to start communicating through email instead. And they even told Ellie they could do all of the paperwork and waivers through email instead of on the phone. So this is all very much still in progress. Any of you who have been through a board complaint process know it can be pretty painful and dehumanizing. And I'm sure you'll agree when I say there are a whole lot of us in Ellie's corner right now. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to my guest, Ellie, for bravely sharing your story with us today. I know it wasn't easy, but you did an incredible job. I also want to express my deep appreciation for my brother-in-law, Beau, who is our show's writer, for the care and dedication he always puts into shaping the stories of survivors into a powerful narrative that highlights the critical issue of therapy harm. Lastly, a big thanks to our audio engineers at Peachtree Sound. For anyone considering starting a podcast, I can't recommend them enough. Their sound quality and attention to detail are outstanding. And they've been invaluable in guiding me as a new podcaster through the process of navigating technical and creative challenges. If you'd like to connect with us, or you have your own story that you would like to share, please feel free to reach out to me at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com. And if you haven't yet, please consider leaving a rating and review. Your feedback helps us to grow and learn. Till next time, thank you for listening.